is our fifth iteration of this symposium, and every year I get to come here and have a little presentation, and I've sort of taken to calling this Ric's dire warning session. So each year I get to come up and say, it's terrible things loom out in our future, everyone be worried. And, that's not the most fun position in the world, but I want to revisit some of my dire warnings. So this is the first symposium. My dire warning in 2009 was that coffee prices were going to go up, and they should probably go up dramatically. And for those of you who follow these things, that's the chart, and it ends just past the time I made that prediction. So I don't get them all wrong. You may recall what happened on the months following that piece of the chart. And the next year, I got to give this dire warning. This dire warning was, listen, there are real threats to the supply of washed Arabica coffee. And those threats really were real. And we were really starting to feel that impact as Colombia went into their third consecutive year of shortfalls in production. Prices have spiked. The opportunity to acquire really great washed Arabica coffees had gotten harder to accomplish and gotten much more expensive. This is another warning the following year. I've pulled this out of here. This is both a warning and a solution. But one of the things that we were cognizant of when we started to try and launch World Coffee Research is the real potential for global warming and climate change to have unforeseen impacts on the supply of specialty coffee. And it's not just the temperature change, it's the change in environmental conditions that creates the petri dish that could allow for a successful pathogen to have a really dramatic impact on coffee. And then last year, I got to warn you guys all about killer tomatoes. Actually, this was my proxy for quality. One of the issues that's faced with specialty coffee is a very narrow band of genetic diversity and a market issue where we're losing touch with the unique qualities that different cultivars can bring to coffee. And this search for quality is impacted by this narrow band, and it's impacted by our inability to effectively market those differences. So when we talk about specialty coffee, we're really talking about differentiation in a product. And so tomatoes are one of those wonderful things that have managed to differentiate themselves in our backyards, but not done a very good job commercially. Coffee, unfortunately, is not something that most of us, at least in these latitudes, get to grow in our backyards, but we need to maintain that differentiation that's available there. So, as you may have guessed, I am going to give another dire warning this year. I try not to just leave them out there naked like, wow, this is a dire warning, everybody go home. And so after my dire warning, the rest of the sessions are sort of, hey, here's some solutions to these potential problems. So all is not lost, in spite of how I may sound. All is still possible. I'm going to shift gears for a second here and talk a little bit about cycles. When I talk about, hey, here's this potentially bad thing that could happen to us, old hands in the coffee business always tell me, Rick, it's a cyclical thing. These things come and they go all the time. And so I wanted to look a little bit at that, and there's a lot of truth in that. This is when specialty coffee was first sort of coming along here in the U.S., there's big national brand and then lots of small to medium players who were trying to work away at little pieces of that market. And, there's some success happens there. You look a little into the future, big national brand is still a strong and solid brand, but you've got other players who have merged also become national players. Some have grown quite large and even larger. Some of the early competitors to this are still around and thriving and healthy, and you see new competitors that have arisen out of the pathways that were pioneered by the early companies in specialty coffee. And of course, there's always a new crop of small guys trying to do a better job, trying to do something exciting and unique and differentiated. And this really is the cycle. Eventually, the big companies get bigger, and then small companies come up, and they grow larger, and the cycle goes on and on. And this does truly happen. But I'm going to suggest that there are some things that are different this time, that some of the activity that's happening in our marketplace is different than this traditional cycle. I also want you to think about the other side of it, the producing side, which is also cyclical. This is the sort of beginning of this concept of prices go up as demand goes up. So this is 1994. We'd burned off pretty much the last of the ICO stocks that come from the time of the ICO agreements limiting supply. And the market started to climb. There was a little weather event in Brazil, and we started to see demand and supply intersect in a way that drove price up. And that's very typical. We see that happen. That's the beginning of the cycle. Once prices start to go up, farmers naturally react, and the thing that farmers do is they get lots of little coffee plants and start growing them. Then after a year or so, they put those little coffee plants out into big fields, and they make lots of coffee, and that coffee gets sold into the market, and the supply and demand equation changes again as supply meets demand, and then this happens. Coffee prices go down. Eventually, supplies shorten up again, demand takes over again, and the cycle repeats. And this, in many ways, proves the adage that old coffee traders always say, which is the cure for high prices is high prices. And it does happen this way. But again, I'm going to suggest that something is different in that cycle today, different than the cycles we've seen in the past. Last year, I showed this slide as part of my warning about challenges to quality. And this slide looks at exportable production and its growth over the years. And if you look at the blue line, that's the trend line at the top, that's the growth in the supply of exportable coffee in Robustas and natural Arabicas. And it's a nice trend line. It meets nicely against our demand curve, which is growing at about the same slope. The red line is the growth for washed Arabica coffee. And in this moment, I'm using washed Arabica coffee as the proxy for specialty coffee. I don't want anybody to think that I don't believe that there are great natural Arabicas, because there are great natural Arabicas. And big steps are happening in Robusta quality. But our business, our livelihoods, our reason for being here is based in this delivering these great washed Arabica coffees into the cups of consumers and making them have a hugely positive experience with coffee. This is still an important slide. It's so important to me that I want to dig just a little deeper into the fundamentals of that. This is another way to look at this. This is world coffee production in 2008, 10, and 12. And you can see, again, it's growing nicely. A little over 140 million bags produced last year. I should qualify that a little bit. That's the 39 ICO member countries plus Peru. There's another, probably a dozen other producing countries that are non-members, and mostly Robusta producers. The total production was somewhere around 145 million bags last year. But if you look at that, the 5 top producing countries, Brazil, Vietnam, Indonesia, Colombia, and Ethiopia, accounted for 70% of that production. 98 million bags of that 140 million bags came from those 5 producers. And let's take a look at what they actually produced. I've cut this graph into millions of bags on the upright axis and in kinds of coffee on the horizontal axis. And if we look, we start with Brazil. Brazil produced 14.5 million bags or so of Robustas. Vietnam weighed in with another 20 plus million bags. Indonesia came along with 8 to 9 million bags of Robusta. Colombia, no Robusta. Ethiopia, no Robusta to speak of. In natural Arabicas, Brazil is in again with over 30 million bags. We've got a little bit of production of natural Arabicas out of Indonesia, effectively nothing out of Colombia. And about almost 70% of the Ethiopian crop, a little over 4 million bags, come in as natural Arabica. The washed mild section, a little bit somewhere between 3 and 5 million bags out of Brazil. It's sort of hard to quantify what's washed and what's semi-washed or some other process other than naturals out of there. Tiny fraction out of Vietnam, a little tiny bit out of Indonesia, though very special, those ones. Nice solid, almost 8 million bags out of Colombia. And then a couple, 2.5 million bags or so out of Ethiopia. These are the top 5 producers in the world. These guys together account for 70% of the world's coffee. And one of the reasons those are the top 5 producers is that by and large, they're successful producers. There's a couple of exceptions in there where it's just a function of land and labor, but in general, these are efficient, successful producers. They're able to bring coffee to market at prices that they can sell into that marketplace. 70%. And if you look at this, we've got about 40 million bags of the total production that's in washed Arabica. So if you break it down a little bit, it's about 29% of the world production overall was in natural Arabicas, another 29% was in washed Arabicas, and the balance of that production was in Robusta. So, change gears one more time. This is, for those of you who have been friends with me for a long time, you know that this is one of my favorite places on earth. This is beautiful Boquete de Panama. It's the coffee center of Panama. And this is a home that's available for sale. And Oddly enough, many Americans, North Americans, Canadians, have been looking at properties in Boquete, Panama as a wonderful place to buy a house and retire. It's just idyllic living there. And one of the things that's happened there is coffee farmers in beautiful Boquete have turned to farming houses instead. It turns out it's a much more lucrative activity, especially in the near term. It's a little more dependable in many ways than the coffee industry. Another great place, I'm sure many of you have been here, to wonderful Alajuela, Costa Rica. Also a favorite spot for North Americans to think about, a nice place to retire, a second home, a place to get away from the awful grind of the coffee business. And it's surrounded there with local beauty and amicable locals. So you've got Tico-friendliness prevailing everywhere there. Also note that the main crops are coffee and ornamental plants, and at the rate we're going here, coffee will be an ornamental plant in Costa Rica. And if you don't believe that, take a look at this. Now, in spite of the fact that Costa Rica has one of the most efficient production systems in terms of yield per hectare anywhere in the world, in spite of the fact that for those of you who have ever had a fabulous Panamanian coffee, if you've ever had a cup of geisha, you may know that they have a wonderfully successful marketing program. This is the production trend for coffee in Costa Rica and Panama since the early 90s. So Costa Rica at one time produced nearly 3 million bags of top quality washed Arabica. This year, about half of that, 1.5 million bags. At its peak, Panama produced almost 250,000 bags, not a huge amount in the world scheme, but almost 250,000 bags. Last year, 104,000 bags total, and of that, only about 50,000 bags were exported. The rest were consumed internally because Panama has a nice taste for its own coffee. And more often than not now, Costa Ricans are starting to like their own coffee as well. So you can see what's happening here is this pressure is being exerted, and this is a manifestation of some of the pressures we've talked about. This is land use pressure. And forget food cultivation, this is condominium cultivation, which is a very attractive business proposition. We're going to see other pressures continue in Mesoamerica and Central America in particular. And it gives rise to a concept that we can talk about a little bit. What does the future of coffee look like? Well, in 2012, as I told you, we've got about an even split between washed milds and natural Arabicas, about 29% of the marketplace, with the other 42% being made up of Robusta coffees. If you extend the growth rates over the next 10 years for the 5 top producers, and you factor in a significant loss of Central American production to Roya, if we lost, say, 30% or 40% of Central American production over the next couple of years, which is a real possibility, and you continue to extend the trend lines, by 2013, washed Arabica production is a mere 20% of total world production. And in just 20 years, in 2033, washed Arabica production is 10% of the world's produce in coffee, just 10%. And I don't want to say that natural Arabica coffees aren't great coffees. There are some fabulous ones out there, and there's always room for technology and innovation to improve that quality. And I certainly don't think we should stop trying to help Robusta farmers increase the quality of their product. But I want to tell you, the market, people keep telling me in the marketplace, there's a lot of demand for Robusta coffee. And I say to you, there's not a lot of demand for Robusta coffee. There's a lot of demand for low-priced coffee because we've got emerging markets that don't have the deep pockets that the mature markets have, and they want to enter into coffee consumption, and they have a price concern for that entry. And we're meeting their price concern by depriving them of the possibility that someday they can enjoy the same great cups of coffee that we have the luxury of enjoying. Because as this supply of washed Arabica diminishes, along with it, farmers start to go away, labor starts to go away, infrastructure starts to go away, mills start to shut down, industry clusters are eliminated, and when that happens, that production never returns. Ask a prime wash producer or an extra prime producer from Guatemala how that business has recovered over the last 10 years. It's non-existent from where it was to where it is today. It's gone. And that business will almost certainly never return. So my dire warning for this year is that we need to pay attention to our core market from the beginning of the value chain to the end of the value chain. And everybody in this room has a stake in that, somewhere in that value chain, that we must pay attention, that we must preserve washed Arabica coffee, that we must value washed Arabica coffee, that we must create the opportunity for those farmers, for those consumers, for ourselves, that this continues to be a part of the fabric of our lives. Or we won't be having a specialty coffee meeting anywhere because there won't be any. There's solutions out there. Peter took you for a walk through here, but I tell you that this opportunity to have innovative thinking, to collaborate, to use science in a way that we haven't in the past, to share that connectivity of coffee, that opportunity exists for us, and it's here today and tomorrow for us to take and to move forward. Now, in this next couple of days, today and tomorrow, we're going to ask you to do a little of this, a little drinking from the fire hose. There's a lot of information coming your way. We've packed this full of information, and it's hard to drink from the fire hose. And you may say, wow, I can't record all this, I can't process all this, I can't get all these notes down. And I say, don't worry about it. You're here to make these face-to-face connections, to let the ideas just bounce around your head, to bounce them off other people. So when you're here, listen a little, talk a little, think a little, interact with each other, and know that what you need most out of this is to take what you need personally in terms of information and connection, that you need to dig in where you find yourself engaged, and most of all, you need to find the capacity to lead where you find yourself inspired. Thank you. Have a great couple of days here. It's going to be a wonderful program.